Those of you who were here found out that last week's session was not recorded. I may end up doing that one as a special add-in because one of the other projects that I was going to be doing for the next sessions in our webinar series, it would basically be 5 or 6 months running, is a on-the-ground, step-by-step what's happening at 2 different sites. There's actually 3 different sites, but 2 in particular are virtually identical. They are virtual monocrop plantations of Robinia pseudoacacia, the black locust, that has basically outcompeted most of the vegetation, so there's hardly any understory whatsoever except a few, invasive non-native weeds, shade-tolerant weeds. And in both sites, we're going to use livestock to begin the process. One of the sites is in the Netherlands, and they just recently, this last week, while they're doing their thing, the first phase was to graze pigs in the forested area to rip up the ground cover on purpose. So to imitate that disturbance, we're going to disturb the ground cover layer to make the site, get the site prepared for the next succession of plants, and then eventually we'll go towards reestablishing the oak wood pasture that's native to Western Europe. However, one branch of the federal government gave them permission to go ahead and do that. Another branch of the federal government shut them down and says you can't do that. And so right now they're stuck in a crossfire between different government agencies, whether they're allowed to do that or not. The other one is in Wisconsin, and then there's a third site that's a much more diverse site that's in New York that we'll also go through as a case study. But so before we get to that, we'll have to do last week's session, because the whole managing your decay cycle is critical for fertility, site fertility on your site, no matter where you live, and we'll get to that next time. So this week was supposed to be just like a leisurely tour through different forest types of the world, and to try to remember everything that we've done in the past 40 weeks and summarize it all in your mind. And these are the places where we are going to ply our trade as restoration agriculture folks, as ecosystem mimicking agriculturists. And let's see if I get my slides to advance. Come on. There we go. Once again, forested ecosystems only cover 21% of the Earth's surface. They're 75% of the terrestrial plant biomass that are in the forest. This is a huge amount of biomass, a huge amount of life, and you think about the energy stored in those systems, because they're constructed of carbon compounds. 47% of all trees are carbon compounds. That is energy, that's fuel, that's food for somebody. That's a serious terrestrial driver. That's a battery. That's a solar collector. We've captured the sunlight. We've taken atmosphere right out of the atmosphere and bound it with water that we've taken from the soil or through the surface of the plant and turned it into these amazing carbon batteries that can be used for so many different things. And we'll study a little bit, or talk a little bit about tonight, about the branch of science that studies the distribution of plants worldwide. How did they get there? Where did they get to where they got to? And it is remarkable how they're adapted to where they live now, but how did they ever get there in the first place? And excuse me, I have a doorway open and it makes the hall echo in my ear. I'm gonna shut it down. That's a branch of science called phytogeography. Plant geography is what I kind of learned it as, is plant geography. Doesn't matter how you remember it, just a fancy word that'll be on the test, right? Thinking about forest types, to most travelers, you walk around, even from place to place within your region, but especially worldwide, you'll notice differences between the forests in East Africa, for example, between that and what you might see in Western Eastern Europe, or South America, Pacific Northwest, Alaska, Australia, Bangladesh. We all have different forest types. So there's similarities, yes. There's similarities in how they operate and function, but dramatic differences in how they're, what species comprise these forests. And most plant geographers recognize 4 basic geographic climactic plant domains. Now, there's different ways to categorize forests around the world. We'll talk about a couple of them tonight, not a lot of them. But the geographic climactic is the main one. Is these are the areas that of the world that have a similar climactic regime to them, and that each climactic regime will have different plant community types that are associated with it, from the boreal and north polar forests, which is what we see on this map right here, the paleotropic, the old world tropics, that's Africa, India, Southeast Asia, the neotropical, which is the South American tropics, Central America to a certain extent, and then the southern oceanic and subantarctic, which is the whole, basically the southern part of the globe. If we start up at the North Pole, you also can start this in reverse from the South Pole. However, the forests in the North Pole are much larger than the forests in the South. So if you go back here, this is what we're talking about, right from the North Pole, starting in this gray zone around here. This is where we'd find the biome tundra. So within the northern polar forests, they're subdivided even smaller into smaller subcategories. And tundra, you could characterize it as it appears to be treeless. There really doesn't appear to be very many trees there at all. Notice, however, we see lots of these little things. There's a lot of mosses and lichens and so on. What's really fascinating, and I'm going to bring it up now, but I'm going to bring it up throughout the rest of the evening, there is one terrestrial plant that can be found in all biomes on the planet. Anywhere where there is life on the planet, this one plant will grow. Different species, different varieties and subvarieties within that species, and those are the grasses. You can find grasses in all regions of the world. So if we want to have a permanent terrestrial agriculture, it really seems to me that our best bet for the most widely adapted plant to provide sustenance for humanity and habitat for wildlife is to include grasses in our mix. But the tundra isn't just grass. The tundra also includes trees. The tundra is loaded with these miniature little trees, and all these fuzzy little catkins right here, these are the catkins on dwarf willow. There's dwarf willows and dwarf birches, and I'm looking around through here to see what I see. These leaves right there look like that's a dwarf birch right there, that little tiny one, if you can see the cursor on the screen. All kinds of miniature trees all over the place, miniature cottonwoods. I've taken butternuts, which will survive a USDA hardiness zone 3 hardiness, and I've brought them up to Alaska and at my homestead in the Mentasta Mountains. And after 10 years had gone by, there were 2 that were alive, and they were, tell you what, they were no taller than this. Even though we were in an area that will support white spruce, 30 to 40 feet tall, 10 meters plus. The butternuts were tiny because the climate that is not their zone. They're so far out of their zone. They didn't freeze from the absolute cold, but the short summer and cold temperatures definitely limited their growth. Obviously, limits to the growth on these northern regions, tundra, well, taiga or taiga, however you pronounce it, is an area of like a tundra ground cover and widely spaced trees that never really get all that tall. It typically is in the higher elevations at, if you were going to be further south into the boreal forest area, it'd be at higher elevations because it's colder, or just before it gets to tundra around the, see if that'll go back. So in these regions right in here would be where you see a lot of the taiga, the boundary between boreal forest and tundra, and the higher elevations in the boreal zone itself. So what are the opportunities? You think about that. What are the kinds of creatures that humans have subsisted on? Because people have lived in these climates. People have lived in these environments. If we go back to here, there's tons of berries. I see these little, I forgot what these were called. I think we call those crowberries, and there's kinnikinnick berries, oodles of berries, blueberries, and blueberries are they're considered a woody plant. They have a woody stem, and they have buds and short shoots and long shoots, just like most woody plants. They're not they're not an herbaceous plant like the crowberry is. Lots of grazing animals. If you look at the northern polar peoples, they're hunter-gatherers, fishermen, and herdsmen. Lots of reindeer herding, for example, in the northern parts of Russia. And the big thing, obviously, that's characteristic of the northern climates is cold. There will be a long, dry period of bitter, bitter hard cold. This is at Eureka Pass, Eureka Summit in Alaska. So in order to get from my homestead to Anchorage, you had to drive down this road. You kind of go this way. This mountain, too bad it doesn't show. It's called Gunsight Mountain. It goes up. It's flat across the top, and there's a notch right in the top of it. And that's what it looks like in the wintertime. It's not a very hospitable place at all. All of the photosynthetic gain and carbon capture has to happen in a very brief period of time in the summertime, when the soil may not even freeze, may not even thaw, excuse me, because all of the tundra and the boreal forests can be underlain, taiga especially, underlain with permafrost, which is soil that never thaws out, always frozen. One of the effects of permafrost is the fact that in the summertime, as it does warm up, the sun does shine on it. Above the Arctic Circle, you'll have 24 hours of daylight in the middle of the summertime, 24 hours of darkness in the wintertime for a period of time. Then it gets longer as this time of year comes by, and then the longest days at June 21st, and then it starts to shorten up again until by next December it's very, very short days, maybe pitch black. I think Barrow, Alaska has 70 days with no sun at all. They don't even see it. Well, in the summertime, if you got 20 hours of light on frozen ground, the land will heat and the surface will thaw, and not really thaw that much. And so you can see these trees pitched a little bit. They'll start to melt, they'll lean in one direction. They don't have any real soil that they can put their roots down into. All their roots are kind of hanging on into the undecomposed litter layer, because obviously at cold temperatures the decomposition rate is extraordinarily slow. So the plants are adapted to dealing with a very low nutrient situation, and then as that ground thaws, they may lean into this little wet puddle of thawed ground. Then all of a sudden it freezes, and then next year maybe that ends up leaning this way, and maybe during the wintertime the ice expands, so these trees tilt back and forth through the years. You can see how this one grew straight for a while, and it grew up this way for a while. It may end up tilting another way. See if we can see a couple of zigzags. These are obviously going in one direction. There's like 1, 2, 3 zigzags on that tree, just the different times as they're leaning and pitching because of the permafrost. They humorously call it the drunken forest. Well, what are the options in the drunken forest? What kinds of plants do we find there? We find things like blueberries, highbush cranberries, lingonberries, raspberries. There's currants that grow there. All of the tundra plants grow there, and in certain places you can find beaked hazelnut will be growing there, and obviously the animals are part of it. Anytime you would want to, you can go through. If you were to open this area up and let more sunlight in, you actually could be melting the permafrost, which isn't always a good thing, especially if you're in a hilly area. You can start some soil slumping if you open it up too much. It's a tricky terrain to deal with on permafrost. And this is up near Chicken, Alaska, so you can see taiga. And like anything else in nature, prairie isn't a thing, and a forest isn't a thing, and a savanna isn't a thing. There are all these phases that are kind of morphing into one another. It's if you look at the colors of a rainbow, you look up at a rainbow, it never goes from, blue, then a straight line and it's green, and a straight line and it's yellow. The blue gradually morphs into green, which gradually morphs into yellow, and so on. It's the same thing with these different vegetation types and plant communities, unless there's a really distinct change in the soil properties or hydrology, or a river comes through and piles up a bunch of gravel. And you can see here all the different deposition layers as this gravel bar put it down. These ones obviously have been there the longest because it's been able to go through succession. You can see some very early patches of vegetation, grass, fireweed, mosses, and then you start to get other material growing in there. Some willows blow in, some cottonwoods blow in. These are probably mostly willows and cottonwoods down on that sandbar. and these obviously had the longest time to grow. This, of course, will change the next deposition if a flood comes up. Water flows down. This is going to change the pattern. It's going to move over here, and maybe there'll be some more deposition behind here. You can even see some of that. Then boreal coniferous forests, the conifer forests, all across the northern hemisphere. I think something like 2/3 of all boreal forests are in Russia. Canada is huge, the whole boreal forest region. Scattered through there will be aspen parklands, which would be areas that aren't all in the conifer forest, but have been burned recently, and the aspens and birches come in real quickly to colonize that site with grasses underneath, and either a grassland if it's drier, or mossy muskeg. This is called muskeg when you see a lot of mushy mosses with these little holes. There's a lot of, we talked about the, I don't even remember the term right now, when you get the, like a puddle of water, the sun shines through it, it acts a little bit like a lens, it warms up the mud underneath it, and then it's a thermal erosion that eventually it keeps heating up, and that water actually will expand, and all these trees can fall right into it. Well, then as it expands to a certain point, for whatever reason, more vegetation grows on, and it stabilizes to a certain extent, and the vegetation mats up, then it has some emergent weeds, then you start to get a litter layer developing on top, and you get a real boggy, spongy, semi-wetland area that then eventually can grow back to trees. So the boreal coniferous forest, or another subdivision within the northern and the polar forest. And of course, western temperate coniferous forest, we talk quite a bit about the whole redwood sugar pine plant community, and we see one of our companions in the redwood sugar pine plant community right over here. This is a beaked hazelnut. Still waiting for all these California folks to start doing some pretty intense breeding with beaked hazelnut and sugar pine. Anywhere and everywhere the redwoods once were, we can do ecological restoration, restore this ecosystem, and we use our agriculture to give us the economic incentive to do it. We have the economic incentive of managing our grasslands, planting our trees on top of that, our redwoods, our sugar pines, our cherries, our plums, apples, hazelnuts, raspberries, blackberries, grapes, currants, and we manage it with our livestock, knowing that 5,000 years from now, our system, when we no longer are managing it, will look something like this. Within all of these categories, of course, whether it's tundra or a boreal forest or the western coniferous forest, soil type obviously affects our plant community, our types. Well-drained soil will have one kind of plant community type. Poorly drained soil, clay soil will have another plant community type. Shallow soils with surface, lots of surface rock exposed will be different plant community types. This is on the Olympic Peninsula. Some really, really beautiful lakes there. Again, don't tell anybody how beautiful the whole Vancouver Island and Olympic Peninsula is, because I mean, it just hates to ruin this place. It's so beautiful. And there's the habitat kind of where I grew up is the eastern deciduous forest. A whole host of different tree species that grow there. I threw this one in. I wanted to throw this one in because this does have a considerable black locust component to it. And you see the young black locust over here. All kinds of vines are rampant. And once again, the soil type, the moisture regime, how much rainfall it gets, the types of rainfall patterns will all affect the plant community distribution that you see. Some of the classic, beautiful New England, southeastern Canada, mixed forests, some conifer forests, some conifers mixed in there with the deciduous forest. And there's a transition zone between the more coniferous boreal forests and the deciduous forest, in which they intermingle. There'll be more coniferous up north with a few of the deciduous trees represented, and flip-flop the other way around with fewer coniferous trees distributed in with the deciduous plants. You get the southern mixed hardwood conifer is another category within the whole northern polar forests. You can see there's some evergreens in here, loblolly pine, pitch pine, longleaf pine, and a whole suite of hardwoods from oaks to hickories to red maple. Red maple is one of the more ubiquitous maple trees in North America. I don't know what the comparable one would be in Europe. And part of what we also see here is some residuals of one of the tree types that used to dominate the site. If you can look at these leaves right over here, the American chestnut used to reign through the whole southern mixed hardwood conifer area. They were considered the redwoods of the East. Some would be 8 and 10 foot in diameter, 200-foot tall trees, gigantic trees, just raining chestnuts all over the place. Of course, chestnut blight wiped them out in the early part of the 20th century. They can be substituted with Chinese chestnut if the climactic zone is warm enough, or hybrid American, European, Chinese crosses where cold hardiness might be an issue if you're in higher elevations or further north in the range of chestnut. There are, of course, pure stands of conifers in the south that actually did happen naturally. And you also remember, through all these areas, from the tundra through the boreal forest, through the western conifers, the eastern deciduous, the southern mixed conifer hardwoods. In all of these areas, there were savanna forms of these plant community types that were semi-open, with grass growing underneath, that had been maintained by fire, and of course grazing animals were all part of the scene. So wherever you live in any of these pictures that we're looking at, what are the opportunities that we have for plant community mimicry? Which trees, tall trees, the canopy layer trees, the subcanopy layer trees, shrubs, vines, canes, understory shade tolerance, herbaceous plants, plants that we can use for grazing, what animals were natural and native to there, which animals would be a good fit for this particular area. How would we disturb the site that would most closely mimic its natural disturbance regime if people weren't around? So how can we insert ourselves into this ecology and produce our food, fuels, medicines, and fibers as our business? We're in the business of doing ecological restoration as our livelihood, and we're doing it and having the incentive to do it by producing food that we're selling. Now, prairie and steppe, steppe is more of the European, Eurasian term for it. They're the grassland areas. Now, what's fascinating about the grassland areas is there are relatively few places on planet Earth where there are grasslands that are just grass and there are no woody plants at all. Even in the Serengeti, the biggest, widest part of the Serengeti, you look out across the horizon, you can't see a tree for miles and miles and miles and miles, but there's little tiny runty trees surviving in the grass. A lot of the Serengeti is underlain with a volcanic hardpan, and so a lot of roots can't penetrate very deep at all. And so their issue is that their roots are restricted to a surface layer, and it just dries out too fast, and it's a moisture issue. A lot of the prairie and steppe regions, moisture is the issue. There'll be prairie remnants nestled within surrounding forest on sandier sites that were once upon a time, either blown in sand dunes or river washed deposition. That water is so well drained that it's just the trees can't quite get established even if there's enough rainfall. In other places it was exuberant fire, just fire happening so frequently that the trees never came to reach canopy status. But in all of the prairies around the world and steppes around the world, woody plants are part of the system. How have people lived in the prairie regions around the world? How might we live in the prairie regions around the world? And if water is one of the limiting factors in these regions, wouldn't it be in our best interest to go ahead and increase the water holding, storage, movement, penetration, capability of this particular landscape so we can support more food plants? Now, none of these areas, they may never be able to host a closed canopy, humid forest. So what? We can still have useful trees in our system, even if they are scattered, 200 meters apart, wherever they are. Subtropical forests in the U.S., this would be kind of like Florida, Alabama. There's a mixture between some of the northern hardwood species that are still growing there and some of the full-on tropical species that are there. There start to be a lot more vines in the subtropics and tropics. The species diversity begins to increase a lot because of our extreme cold is no longer an issue. The cold definitely establishes a more fixed dormant period and growth period, and so there is less periodicity in plant growth. There are more likely to be some plants that will continually grow in the subtropics. What different plants can we use here? And look around if you live in these regions here. What are the useful plants for human beings, and how can we imitate this in structure and function and have an ecologically restored subtropical forest community that we're deriving a livelihood from by restoring it? Maybe starting with a pineapple plantation or a old abandoned rice farm and converting it into a three-dimensional subtropical food producing paradise. And then there's the full-on tropics. I don't know where I mention it later on, but excuse me, maybe it's under rainforest part. One of the things about the full-on tropics is that there are disproportionately more epiphytes, these plants that require no soil. They get most of their nutrients from the air. A lot more vines, lianas, and the highest species diversity of any terrestrial system on Earth is in the tropical rainforest. And of course, what is the major disturbance factor, has been the major disturbance factor worldwide. This is in boundary waters, Minnesota, boundary between northern Minnesota and Canada. It's kind of a transition zone between northern hardwoods and the boreal forests, the evergreens. You obviously see the tall white pines here and some spruce. There will be some hemlock in there. Balsam fir will be growing up in the sun in the short term. Fire is the #1 dominant disturbance in all of the northern polar forests around the globe. Wind is another major disturbance pattern. What happens in a fire? If it's a ground fire, the surface is being disturbed. We're eradicating the surface vegetation and exposing bare mineral soil. You have a nice black soil. Getting rid of a lot of the organic matter just goes away. It turns into heat. One of the things that if you think about, if there are 8,000, this relates to last week's webinar, if there are 8,000 BTUs of energy in 1,000 pounds of wood, if you burn that, the majority of those BTUs get converted right into heat and they go away up into the atmosphere. Well, think about the energy. If 8,000 BTUs of energy, if you took all of that heat and instead of turning it into heat, turned it into metabolism of organisms, if you take the same amount of biomass and you decay it rapidly, just imagine the life forms that can live with all of that energy, all of the decomposer organisms that are just going to town and pooping and peeing and reproducing and eating one another and all that sort of stuff. That's, I think, probably for a management perspective, if I want yields out of my system, instead of burning my biomass, I want to decompose the biomass, a different kind of burning. I'm going to get rid of that surface vegetation, and it's gone. It's not going to be competing with the other vegetation. And if we do it as a biological release, we'll be interacting with the subsoil and mineralizing the mineral particles in the soil. And that now becomes fertility for the other plants in the system. And wind, once again, all this biomass gets knocked over. We'll see a lot of the pit and mound architecture that we see over here with an excavated down to the bare mineral soil, and we'll see the organic matter mixed with the root plate as that tips up. We've seen lots of slides of that in the earlier webinars on disturbance. So this is, we have swales and berms going on that will collect more water, create little microsites, And obviously there's a lot of tremendous amount of organic matter here. This looks like mushroom heaven about to happen. So fire and wind are still our main disturbance factors in the northern polar forest. What's the number one disturbance in the polar forests worldwide? Human beings. We cut it down, we bulldoze it, we burn it, we build our cities on it, we build our cities out of it. You know, Homo sapiens is the largest disturbance on the natural ecosystems of this planet, without a doubt these days. You know, we are the biggest terrestrial disturbance factor. It's real. We can use it as a destructive force, or we can use it as a tool. If we understand how our planet's ecosystems work and interact with those ecosystems in such a way that we help them to regenerate, to create more of themselves, to produce a surplus, natural surplus, that they've taken sunshine and atmosphere and water and turned it into an incredible array of usable goods and medicines and industrial ingredients, we can use our disturbances to recreate and to restore habitats around the world, and that's the work that we're engaged in. That's the restoration part of the restoration agriculture. This is the opposite of restoration agriculture. This is where they're taking a forest and they're removing most of the material and creating an open grassland to graze their animals. You see all the skidder roads here dragging all the logs out. They have their compound where they have their residence now, and they've got like a few sheep or goats or cattle that they're grazing here. This is not the kind of silvopasture that I'd like to encourage. This is not restoration of an ecosystem. This is the degradation of a closed canopy forest and turning it into a open canopy grassland. This is agricultural encroachment into intact forest habitats. I would like to do it the other way around. I would like to do woody encroachment into agricultural land, but instead of degrading the agricultural resource base, we can do it in such a way that we actually aggrade the agricultural resource base, produce more food, more fiber, more building materials, more wildlife habitat per acre by restoring the semi-wooded area. So if this was an agricultural field that we're planting trees into, that would be a restoration project. If it's cutting trees down to create a savanna where it has been a closed canopy forest for eons, that's going the wrong way. That's not what we're doing. What's the biggest limiting factor on all these terrestrial forested ecosystems? Think for a second. So we got fire. I thought you said fire was the biggest disturbance. Well, that's the biggest disturbance. And what about windstorms? What about people? You know, what about volcanoes? Well, the biggest limiting factor on all of these terrestrial forested ecosystems is water. Without this stuff, we don't have any tree growth at all. We have to have water in order to grow any kind of plants. The more water we have, commonly, the more plant growth we have. So managing our water resource, whether you're in New Mexico, Arizona, you know, Kazakhstan, Bangladesh, Mexico, Melbourne, all of our situations are different. We get different rainfall patterns, different seasonality with the rainfall. Mark from Bangladesh was just saying that they get about 2 months worth of rain and then that's it. They'll get occasional showers, but only 2 months of effective rainfall. Well, how do you deal with that amount of water? It may come down in huge tropical thunderstorms. You might get, you know, half a meter of rain in a day. Well, if all that rain just goes away, it does your plants no good unless you store it in the landscape, on the landscape, in tanks and ponds. You store it wherever you can so you can use it for productivity. Other places like in southern Louisiana where we've been, in the Netherlands, river deltas around the world, Bangladesh included, the issue might be too much water, and the fact that the water table is just a few inches below the surface, and or 1 centimeter sea level rise can now go in across flat land for, you know, kilometers at a time. Water is an issue. We need to manage our water resource so as to optimize the ecological functioning of the systems that we design. So in addition to like the climactic descriptors that we were using from the different climate zones. You can also describe forests by their outward appearance, but the physiognomy. There's the closed canopy forest. We've seen a couple pictures of that where all the trees grow up, they completely close the canopy. There's no more grasses, very little understory growing underneath because of lack of light, lack of water. Well, then there's open woodland, which is a semi-open savanna-type wood pasture, open woodland and grassland. You can describe wooded ecosystems, forested ecosystems by their appearance, as well as the structure. Is it an evergreen forest? We already talked about the evergreen forest and deciduous forests in the previous slides. And then thorn forest is also a term that's used. This is, oh man, I hope I put the slide in. There was a slide that I was going to grab, which was this one right here. This is just a different physiognomic structural classification of forests, different types. Tropical rainforest, evergreen seasonal forest, semi-deciduous forest, seasonal rainforest, mangrove, temperate, and so on and so on. We'll talk about some of these. We don't have time for all of those. Some of the ones that also won't have time to talk about is the sclerophyllous forests. There's let's take a lot of the Mediterranean type plants that we see, especially in the oak family genus, actually, Quercus. The leaves will be thick, real leathery. They're coated with a waxy or a soapy coating to protect against water loss. Oftentimes they have thorns on their edges. These are sclerophyllous plants. I'll show at least a couple pictures of thorn forests. These are commonly in the USA. These thorn forests are more commonly referred to as, deserts or desert scrub. And then the woodlands, this is semi-open. So there's closed canopy forest, woodlands, which are all your different savanna types, and then scrub. There's a whole whole host of things. Just go to California and look at most of the coastal range, all of the scrub chaparral that's on that particular area. So the appearance of the forest, most of the appearance of the forest is driven by water issues. Once again, how important water is. The better drained sites will have less available water, even if they get more rain. Seriously poorly drained areas like the Serengeti, for example, during the rainy season, I've been at the boundary line between the Serengeti National Park and the Ngorongoro Crater National Park during the rainy season, and you see green grass everywhere, but reflected off everything is water, and the whole place was just covered with water, that deep, including the roads, and so the water wasn't draining. It had fallen and just had to take time for it finally to flow away, and then of course it'll be 9 months without any rain at all. So if you guys just want to look at these different pictures, these are very, I think these are very well done physiognomic sketches of the different forest types based on, drainage, how wet, how dry, how cold, how tropical they are. These are really cool sketches. That's why I threw them in there. So you can just go somewhere, you go to a particular site, you just look at the plants, you go, oh yeah, I know what the climate's like, I know what the soil is like. If we're going to be doing a permaculture, following the permaculture adage of observing nature and then imitating its patterns, you just go to a site, you look at it, you say, oh, I know what the rainfall pattern's like, I know what the subsoil drainage is like, I know if this is a hot region, a cold region, I know how far from the equator I am, if I'm near the poles or if I'm near the equator, based on the physiognomy of the vegetation. And this is an example. I know we talked about this before. It seems pretty obvious that you can tell the difference between rainfall patterns by looking at that vegetation and looking at that vegetation. There's a difference, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to say, this is probably drier than this. It probably doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that this is probably colder than this. What does take a little bit more skill and knowledge and understanding is the different plant shapes we talked about before. When capturing sunlight at a high latitude, a nice, straight, tall, pointy solar panel is more easily able to capture low angle light that might be coming in at this angle. It's got the big solar panel to it, whereas this big, wide top right here is capturing sunlight from the top. Tropical, very tropical. And similar species of trees, just a few hundred miles further north, they're kind of tropical-ish, but look, they're kind of leaning because now they're leaning towards where the dominant sun is most of the time. So we can learn a lot about a place just by its physiognomy, what the plant communities look like. And if we want to go and live here, and if we think that we can turn this into this, there might be a small degree of hallucination going on, because it's not entirely likely that you're going to be able to get this out of that. We can get a more efficient and more effective and more productive this, and it will also begin to throw more raindrop nuclei up into the atmosphere. It'll keep more humidity around. There'll be a lot more humidity down in the lower environment. You'll start to see the grasses start to flourish. So this will become dramatically more humid and begin to look a lot more like this. So those of you who follow Neil Spackman's webinars on the EAT platform here, you know, if Neil is expecting to get this from his work in Saudi Arabia, that's probably a long time coming, maybe thousands of years before he could ever have enough humidity around like that. But it's probably not too unrealistic for him to get to a point like this where they'll have grasses persisting on the ground year-round, even though they're brown and dry. It is entirely possible that they could get some sort of vegetation like that going in Saudi Arabia. Swamp forests. They're also from coastal to inland. There are forests that are totally adapted to wet areas. This is down in Louisiana, and those of you who have not seen the back of Wayne's Head, that's the back of Wayne's Head. We had the good fortune of working with a client down in Louisiana who has property on both sides of a canal, the Intracoastal Waterway, and on the south side of the canal, it's all semi-natural, unmanaged bayou country, and it seems to me that it's mostly silt deposits and fallen vegetation that's decaying, that is the soil. And anytime you see trees, there's just enough dry enough material that the trees can get established, that their roots don't rot, or they're the types of trees that actually can live semi-submerged much of the time, such as cypresses, which I believe I have in here. Water is the thing here. The trees are a minor part of it. The aquatic systems and the estuarine systems, which are semi-aquatic. This is fully aquatic, and this is more estuary type. These are some of the most biologically productive systems on the planet. And if you're living in a place like this, yes, you can go grow all these different woody crops up above, but you might as well grow the ones that are going to be semi-flooded adapted, because if you try to grow any species that require dry soil, you're probably going to end up in failure. Humidity can be extreme down here, 100% humidity in the air all the time. There'll be lots of epiphytes, epiphytic lichens hanging from the trees. And if you try to grow plants that are fungally susceptible, you're going to get fungus. It's just part of the system down here. It's very humid, very wet. Other systems, such as a mangrove system, I didn't take this picture here. Mangroves are classic in that they the seed starts to sprout as they're floating along, and they can drop from the parent tree, and the root has started to come out of the radical has started to come out of the seed, falls into the water and gets stuck in the sand, and they actually have mechanisms to desalinate the water that's coming into them, so they can actually get rid of the salt in the water. Of course, oysters and mussels, all sort of is a whole entire ecosystem within mangroves. And mangrove forests, believe it or not, around the world are somewhat threatened. And these are what are protecting our shorelines. They're actually what's expanding the shorelines. Now imagine a little bit of a flood that comes through and it brings some silt with it. Flood comes up, it runs into this tangle. Now all that silt gets deposited. Now you're actually creating new real estate. So people say, well, they're not creating any new real estate anymore. In part, the reason why that's happening is because we aren't saving and propagating our mangrove swamps across the world. Another type of swamp, one of my favorites, are the white cedar swamps. They're classic northern central USA. I'm assuming there's got to be some comparable plant community types in Europe of cedar swamps. And one of my favorite stories was in a cedar swamp. I've got some timber property up in Maine. You've seen some pictures of it, and it's on the top of a hill. It's they call it Bear Mountain over there. It's about a 1,000-foot tall mountain for 70 miles from the coast. That's actually a pretty big lump. It's one of the first foothills to the Appalachian Mountains. Well, because the glaciers had come through the area, scraped these mountains into a particular shape, and then dropped off the hard rock on the far side, at the base of these sharp mountains, there's low rounded hills with cliffs on the southeast side and rubble piles at the bottom. So my cabin was up on the top, see if you can see here, and I went down the hill and I'm walking across the rubble piles, big boulder piles. It's lots of fun. And then I came to an area that looked like this. It was cedar swamp, and so I started walking through it. But whenever I would step on a low spot, I'd break through the mosses and the roots that were there, and I'd be up to my thigh in water, ice cold water. And then I realized what was happening is this was actually the lake. It was a real shallow part of the lake that was all filled with boulders. And gradually over time, the mosses got established on the boulders, and then maybe a seed flies in, grows on the moss, and then it would somehow connect to the next one. Then litter would fall and accumulate between the trees, and eventually the whole rocks in shallow water got covered with vegetation, and so you had the cedar swamp on top. And if you stood on a high point like this, you would be all right. So I had to spend my time jumping from high point to high point, and you jump on a high point, the moss slips off, you slip, you fall, you fall into the lake, and it was getting dark, and it was November of the year when it gets rather cold at night, about 20 degrees Fahrenheit at night, and so I ended up having one heck of a crash for about 1.5 miles through falling down trees with poking dead branches, falling into the lake periodically, scratching my shins on thighs as I slipped off the rocks. I still love cedar swamps, though. They're really fascinating places. Lots of unique endemic vegetation that will only survive there. And of course, tropical rainforests is the highest biodiversity anywhere on Earth. It's highest proportions of epiphytes of anywhere else, lianas, vines, anywhere else. There's the highest proportions of plants that have buds with no bud scales. It's the highest numbers of plants that have an entire leaf margin. We didn't talk about individual plant physiology to that detail, but the margin of a leaf is the edge of the leaf. And entire means it's smooth and single, not lobed. My hand, like here, is lobed, multi-lobed. You can also have serrated and so on. And then drip tips at the end of a leaf, a little point, so any water that comes down to the leaf will drip off the end of that leaf. It's the highest proportion of any system that has most plants with multiple shoot flushes. It'll grow for a period of time, grow another period of time, and another period of time. A lot of buttressed trunks, and there actually are more nutrients above the ground than in the soil. The soil can actually still be bare mineral rock, very devoid of mineral nutrients. So if you cut it all down and haul it all away and try to plant an agricultural system, you've got no nutrients in the soil. You just exported all your nutrients in the vegetation. So a chop and drop system here is even more important. So like what Hans Getsch is doing in Brazil, this is where your nutrients are. The same is true in the more temperate climates. However, we got a lot more activity going on in the soil. You put this down in the tropics, it'll rot real fast. That's another thing. If you remember me talking about the drunken forest, how it was just a lot of moss on the permafrost and a lot of litter on the permafrost. In the colder climates, either altitude or latitude, is that the litter falls and it doesn't decay as fast as it falls. And so you'll begin to accumulate a duff layer that eventually over time turns into peat, and it gets thicker and thicker and thicker, and pretty soon any plants that are growing in the peat, they have hardly any access to any mineral nutrients, and there's hardly any decomposition rate going on. So there's no new minerals being released into the system, that are not mineralizing into the system. So the soil becomes less and less fertile. And so a lot of the emphasis on organic matter accumulation, that's regenerative. Well, to a certain point. You can get too much carbon in your soil, and then as you have too much carbon in your soil, you don't have enough decomposition rate going on to release the minerals into the soil food web, into your plants, and so you will actually impoverish the soil over time with excessive peat accumulations. The opposite happens in the tropics, and that you put a leaf on the ground, it decomposes quick, those nutrients are cycled right in incredibly rapidly. And so there's a whole range of differences that are governed by temperature, by water, altitude, latitude. Between more organic matter accumulates than can decompose, or here, decomposition happens so fast that you can't get organic matter accumulation. That was actually an incredibly complex little description I did in like 5 seconds. We'll have to remember that mark for later. All kinds of different subcategories of forests. There's mountain forest, the montane forest, and the cloud forest. It may not actually rain a whole heck of a lot there, but they get plenty of moisture from the fogs. The whole area around San Francisco Bay reminds me of that because of all the morning fogs in Northern California. Costa Rica, I think, is notorious for most of it being totally cloud dependent. There's mossy forests. These can happen latitude-wise, altitude-wise. Obviously, there's a lot of atmospheric moisture, and it's not necessarily clouds. It can just be pure humidity that's causing this. And then in the more tropical areas, it's more often at the higher altitudes. This particular picture was taken in California at a fairly high, it's not really a high altitude, it's a fairly high altitude rolling hill, but it gets very, very little rainfall, but it gets a reasonable amount of clouds. And so the clouds and the humidity in the atmosphere are what the plants are growing on, not from rainfall. These were all different forms. And just think of all these different forms that we've been looking at. What are our options in those places? Are we going to go do a food forest that we saw on a YouTube video with our little apple tree here and a nitrogen fixating tree here and a couple of daffodillies here and a comfrey plant there, and what? Well, why not mimic the natural ecosystem that's around using the disturbance pattern that is common to those particular plant communities and manage it as a semi-natural, food-producing montane forest, cloud forest, mossy forest, elfin woodland. The elfin woodlands are similar to what we talked about earlier, which is more northern or higher latitude and altitude. The crumholes, which is a dwarfed forest. This is mostly evergreens. These are probably only 3.5 foot tall. These are a lot of white spruce and black spruce, red spruce. This is in Maine. A lot of balsam fir. There was a lot of crumholes tufts up high altitudes, not high altitudes like icy high, but the mountain I lived on in Alaska, just a few hundred yards up the hill from us, it went to like a taiga tundra mix with these little pockets of crumholes, these little tiny miniature forests. You could tell these are ancient trees, but they were only like this big around and 1 meter high. Monsoon forest. This poses some of the most incredible challenges. Is you got tropical heat 365 days of the year, but you only get rain for a month or two out of the season. The diversity isn't as great as in a full-on tropical rainforest, where it was rainy all the time. But there's a tremendous diversity available to you, and this is where I've done more of my work in the tropics, is in areas that have more monsoon climate. This is actually in Uganda, and this is what some of the natural systems look like in the monsoon type areas. And a monsoon isn't a particular kind of rainstorm. It's just the type of climate pattern that has one or two rainy periods during the course of a year. There may be two distinct rainy periods, or a big one and a little one next to each other. They may be at different times of the year, but it's characterized by a rainy season and a long, protracted dry season. And in the tropics, hot and dry means hot and dry. So when you do get all this rain, it's very, very important to capture it in the ground. And there's a lot of really epic, heroic work being done by permaculturists, restoration agriculturists all across the world in the monsoon tropics. And here's an example right here. This is in Uganda. And just look at the mix of plants, from bananas to breadfruit to cassava to, there's an avocado back there not doing too well. You got maize growing in the patches in between. I know that this guy, they have chickens that they're running around in there. They when they cut down or knock down a banana tree, they drill holes in the stem and they plant mostly greens. They'll do I think it's in the mustard green family. They'll plant that, and they use a lot of these chopped up greens. They call it spinach, but it's not the spinach that we're accustomed to. These are some of my heroes in East Africa. This is Wanjara McJoel. His part of Uganda just recently has gone through some pretty extreme turmoil. I also want to have a shout out to Lapalo Gideon. Wanjara was able to escape some of the violence in his particular area. Lapalo has decided to stay. I didn't go to that part of Uganda this February because it probably would not be a good idea to be walking around that part of Uganda with that colored skin in these times. They chop them up in little pieces, and the police come in and just do what they want, and there's military going on. It's a mess over there. Look at the Turkana region if you want to stay abreast of the news. There's been several different eco projects, permaculture projects in that part of Kenya and Uganda that have been destroyed. There is an issue in emergent property that we haven't really dealt a lot with, but if you all of a sudden create something that's wonderful and incredible and fantastic, those who don't have that may be so desperate as to want to come and destroy yours, take it away from you. So we have to somehow figure out how can we spread the abundance fast enough so that we don't get stuff taken away from us and endanger our lives and those of our friends. This guy is he's Marcus. He's pretty amazing. He's a permaculture teacher in Tanzania. Worked at a couple of projects with me. It kind of worked side by side for a while. I caught him one day with my first edition hardcover permaculture designer's manual, which was already falling apart. And what I caught him at, he was sitting down as he would read a page. You could see he was reading it, and then he would sit up straight and tall, and then he would say it out loud. And that so-and-so has memorized the whole entire permaculture designer's manual by heart, and he can recite it word for word. There was a little girl in the same village that had read Restoration Agriculture and was able to recite the whole doggone thing by heart. So these people learn it, they live it, and for them, this means survival. This guy right here is probably the most easygoing, casual guy about doing this type of ecosystem restoration while producing food. Farmer John, he's the land manager and takes care of, I think he's got like 20 or 30 children that aren't his. He's not associated with any NGOs at this time. He and his partner basically have been taking in orphan kids and giving them a place to stay and feeding them and developing this permaculture paradise in the meantime. And he actually is the truck driver of a papaya, so far as a papaya growers co-op that involves folks from this village and this village as well. And probably the rock of all rocks is this guy right here. I only know him as Mzee Katula. He's probably the grumpiest, most stern, harshly critical person I ever saw at first, not saying a word until he all of a sudden saw that these kind of systems work, and now he's out as an elder teaching how to use an A-frame, do the water management. And so this is this Mzee Katula works with Marcus and Farmer John here, propagating these systems through villages in Tanzania. So a shout out to all of you guys working in the tropical monsoon areas. Then dry forests. These tend to have lower species diversity than more mesic forests, more wetter forest types. We can work with this. People have lived here. Think to Kalahari. How do we imitate this in structure and function, and how do we enhance the growth of our desired woody plants? It's probably not a good idea to go try to grow something water hungry like bananas here, even though it might be warm enough. Or what about if you go to a place like this? What if you plump yourself right down in the middle of the corn and soybean belt of North America or South America or wherever you are? How on earth do we accomplish ecosystem restoration while paying our bills, feeding our family, providing ourselves with building materials, and living a good life? How about managing our water resource? Let's put in our swales and our berms. And in my case, this is both these pictures with New Forest Farm. This is like 20 years ago. This is probably 17, 18, 19 years ago. How the water, instead of going down this valley this way, hits these swales and goes out towards the ridge that way. The water, instead of running down the middle of this valley, splits up and goes out towards the ridge, and it sheets off across the ridge. Moving that water across, then imitate the natural plant communities, which happen to be oaks. This is a clump of hazelnuts. This is a thicket of wild plum. This is a hickory. Over here there are some, these are cherries. This is crab apples, prairie crab apples. That's a prairie crab apple right there. And there's a lot of staghorn sumac in that little sinkhole right there. Manage your water resource, imitate the natural ecosystem, natural plant communities, use your agroforestry practices. Go ahead and grow annual crops. If that's what you can do in order to cash flow or feed your family, grow your annual crops. They're really important while you're establishing your woody crops in between the rows. Here's a crop. I think this year was probably acorn squash here, and this is a row of trees, chestnut trees, and then this is a field of wheat. Currently, right now, this is a stand of pines. You've seen a lot of pictures in the past few weeks down here of that area that got kind of invaded with black locust that we're clearing out, and that's me driving my tractor. Use your agroforestry practices. Grow a row of trees in between your fields. This happens to be cereal rye, but instead of just a single tree, have trees with something growing underneath, like sunchoke, Jerusalem artichoke, a root crop. Chives, which are an onion, it's an allium. So we have multiple yields coming out of the tree row, even before we have trees coming out of the tree row, and we're cash flowing, feeding our family with our annual crops in between. And start planting trees. What kind of a optimistic weirdo was I to go out and dig into the sod and plant a little tree and put a stake next to it? Plant a tree, plant a tree. This is out in chestnuts. This is the oldest chestnuts on New Forest Farm, and this is a little, it wasn't a sinkhole at the time, but it is a sinkhole now. It's all caved in, and you can see the rock, and there's badgers living down in the tunnels in there. And everywhere you see one of these stakes, there's a little tree planted there. Crazy optimist. Pick a spot. This is the only patch of woods. This is easily 21 years ago, because that's where our house is now. And we dug it right into this little hillside below the ridge. So that part of the picture there is north. We'll be out of the winter winds. We'll be south facing. We could have solar heat in the summertime. We can generate electricity with a solar panel, yet we're close enough to the ridge to get a little wind on a little mini wind turbine there. Start building with your family. We can go anywhere on this planet, and this is part of the whole point. The whole restoration agriculture suite of techniques. Using these techniques, we can go anywhere. We can borrow money, and we can buy land. We can produce crops at a net profit, pay our bills while building our house, teaching our children how to have a good work ethic. And this little guy right here, in that picture, he's less than 2 years old. He's 1.5 actually, or 1 3/4, and he grabbed a block hammer, which is a little hammer with a flat back that you tap on a concrete block or on a rock. You tap on it and tap on it, and it makes these little micro fractures. And in the case of a concrete block, if you draw a line on it, you just tap it over and over and over again, and eventually it'll go tink, 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 then you'll hear it go tunk, 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 tunk. It changes the sound, and when it changes that sound, you just pop it, it'll break right off. By the time I got up to about this high putting in concrete blocks, he saw me cutting blocks. Every time you see a half block there, it's been cut using a block hammer, just chipping at it. And so there's half blocks here, here, here. Well, once I got up to this level here, he insisted on using the block hammer. And so he's got a helmet with hearing protectors and goggles, and he's got the block hammer in his hand to draw a line on it. And to him, it was probably like you or I would have like a 40 or 50-pound sledgehammer, and he'd be swinging this hammer at it and just singing away. Then all of a sudden, when it would make the sound, he'd go tap, 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 tap. Then all of a sudden, he'd go, oh, pop it, Dad, pop it, which meant it made that sound. I'd just pop it and break the blocks. So from this level up, every block that you see that's a partial block, he cut it. This was cut by a 1-year-old. I didn't enslave this 1-year-old. He wanted to hang out with Dad. He wanted to build a house. Let's get our children involved with living this ecosystem restoring regenerative life. Let's live a good, rich, full life. It's going to change through time. This is just a year later. We moved from just living in the cellar to having what the little guy referred to as the high roof. And then, of course, that's been walled in since then. And see these little tree cages over here, protecting the young trees from rodent girdling. And this picture right here is taken from that spot right up over there, looking down towards the house. Till eventually you have these beautiful fields with grass and trees and shrubs and bushes and vines and daffodils and currants and grapes and elderberries and mulberries and pigs and cows and honeybees. And we've got this jungle forest that all of a sudden now, once upon a time, was a cornfield or a wheat field, now is food trees everywhere. And what's not a food tree is biomass for chop and drop. That's our fertility cycle, and or it's forage for livestock, which is part of our fertility cycle, and it's food for us, and it's cash for sales, and or we're cutting for mushroom inoculation. We're developing a deep three-dimensional canopy structure to capture as much sunlight as we can, to capture as much air as we can, to capture as much humidity as we can on this site to have the most productivity. So all three of these sites are my sites, the various different places. Some disclosed, well, that one's not. Some disclosed locations and some not disclosed locations. Until someday we are now surrounded by these ancient, beautiful beings that are producing all kinds of food with virtually sheer total utter neglect. So instead of having a chestnut orchard, for example, I've got chestnuts. I already mentioned elderberries, currants, grapes, raspberries, mulberries, cattle, pigs. 8 different things come out. The daffodils were in there. So there's 9 different things coming off of here. That doesn't even count the wildlife that's living out here. I have plenty of squirrels. With no off-site fertility inputs, no off-site irrigation inputs. This is a self-generating system. It is regenerating. It's regenerating it all by itself. Chestnuts are taking over. There's hazelnuts that are growing all over the place. There's apples, Nanking cherry, my favorite. These beautiful little bush cherries are propagating all over the place. This is a regenerative food system. It manages its water. It imitates the natural plant communities. It's perennial based, and we use animals as the driver in the system to give us the incentive to actually take care of the system, do the breeding work that we need to live a good, rich life, eat wonderful mushrooms while we're decaying all of this biomass that wasn't growing there before. We have made the world a better place. We can walk away from it, and it'll keep going. It's propagating. It's spreading. And be not afraid of greatness. This is what we are called to. We are called to start wherever we are right now, even if it's with one little acorn in the crack between the sidewalk and the barrier that keeps the cars from coming onto the sidewalk in the parking lot in front of your apartment, to deserts around the world, agricultural land around the world. It is our job to create the abundance of the future, to plant the ecosystems of the future, because nobody else is doing it. We can do it as our livelihood, But we can't do it alone. We've got to stick together, learn from one another, and know that at the end of the day, it's entirely possible that one of those trees that you put in the ground will still be here 4,000 years from now, still producing food, still producing wood, still producing medicines, building materials, and becoming a monument to somebody who planted this chestnut tree, who planted El Castaño de Cento Cavalli. I tell you what, whoever did it, whoever planted the mango tree in Mzecatula's village,